I am Joe Haberman, a resident here in Duluth, and I want to thank you all for being here. Virg, Boehland, David Cobb, and Ruthi Engelke. Move to Amend is a growing movement locally and nationally. Virg, you've headed up the local effort, and I believe you've connected with more than 1,200 interested people. David and Ruthi, you're on the national leadership team, and I know that the movement is growing very swiftly across the United States as well. David, can you outline what Move to Amend is all about for us?
I can, and thank you. And first, I want to just acknowledge we're having this conversation because we're on community television. One of the very few places in media where we, the people, can talk to each other without the corporate filter. So a big shout out and an acknowledgement to you, the viewer, but also to this institution as a place where ordinary people can have conversation. Move to Amend is a multiracial, intergenerational mass movement of people who recognize that corporations are not just exercising power, they're ruling us. As surely as masters once ruled slaves, as surely as kings once ruled subjects, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are making the decisions. Corporate CEOs are deciding how to protect the environment or if to protect the environment in the great Minnesota North. Corporate CEOs are deciding how much poison and toxics can be in the water supply or the air that we all breathe. Corporate CEOs decided to take this country into war. And we, the people, get to choose between Coke or Pepsi, paper or plastic at the grocery store checkout line. We are at best treated as if we are consumers, but not treated as if we are empowered citizens. So what do we do? Move to Amend is taking that issue head on by addressing the United States Constitution, the supreme law of the land, the document that is supposed to be our political legal framework for how we govern ourselves. And looking at that, what we've realized is that the legal system is not facilitating justice and fairness and democracy. It's actually empowering and enshrining the same wealthy elite. So Move to Amend is a campaign to abolish in its entirety the illegitimate court-created idea that a corporation is a person with constitutional rights and that money is First Amendment protected political speech. Joe, the reason that we focus on those two things is those are foundational legal doctrines. Not just one bad court decision like Citizens United, not just one bad bit of legislation, but core doctrines for how the small ruling elite have hijacked our sacred right to self-government. And as a lawyer, what really pisses me off, they're using the legal system to legitimize the theft and telling us that there's nothing that we can do about it. Well, we at Move to Amend say there is something that we can do about it.
Ruthi, what would you like to add?
I would just like to add that this is a movement, this is a democracy movement that is nationwide. We have about 50 affiliates all over the country, Duluth being one of our first ones. A lot of this started here. So we have people working on this all over the country, and I am watching this movement and these people begin to really start to take ownership of their rights as citizens, their rights as human beings, and looking more to what they can do to change the system. And I just think it's a beautiful thing to work with people like you all.
Virg, you've been a leader locally for a long time, and this has been something that you have really put a lot of effort into. What would you like to say at this point?
I want to kind of go across some of the other numbers because the numbers are quite incredible. The 1,200 number you mentioned, that's the number of people who have signed on to the Duluth area Move to Amend, but not just that. And it's really important that they go to the national Move to Amend page and sign on, and those people have already done that. Locally, we've got 350 members who have signed on our Facebook page, and that started with 0 about 3 or 4 years ago. In Minnesota, we have 10,600 now members.
That sounds about right. It's the land of 10,000 lakes. We've got about 10,000. I like that.
That'll be easy to remember. I'm hoping to increase that number to way more than the lakes. But
and Virg is mentioning the website. Does somebody want to give the website?
Sure,
yes.
Sure. It's www.movetoamend.org. And you can just click on a button to sign the petition and add your name to the over 400,000 people.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then part of the discussion that I think is important maybe to get clear is somebody might get the idea that I don't like corporations, that I think corporations are bad. Inherently, they don't have to be bad. I don't know, David, can you?
Sure. I think it's important to really understand the idea of corporate constitutional rights, sometimes shorthand corporate personhood. I want to be clear, Move to Amend is not anti-corporation. A corporation is nothing more than a tool created under law under the corporate chartering process. You can be a nonprofit corporation, a for-profit corporation, but all it is an instrument or tool created under law. And like any tool, it can be used productively, and like other tools, it can also be used destructively. And I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, Move to Amend's campaign around corporate constitutional rights only addresses the illegitimacy of corporations being able to claim constitutional rights. Now, Joe, that's not something that only lawyers should concern themselves with, because this doctrine of corporate constitutional rights allows corporate lawyers to go into court and overturn environmental protection laws, worker safety laws, public health laws, campaign finance laws. If to assert a constitutional right is to say some aspect of the political process has infringed upon my rights. As a human being, I do have rights that are sacred and sacrosanct, as do you, Ruthi, Virg, you, the viewer. All of us have rights that are sacred, that are not subject to the political process, and if a law, even if it goes through some democratic process, infringes upon our constitutional rights, the law is an invalid exercise of the political process. Like Jim Crow segregation laws went through a democratic process in the South. But they were illegitimate because they violated the human rights of people, and it was appropriate for the court to step in and overturn those laws. This is my point. A corporation is a tool, nothing more, nothing yet less. How to handle that tool, what to do with that tool, what to allow that tool to do or not do, is a political decision that should be handled through the political process. When the courts create the idea that corporations have constitutional rights, they've just turned we the people from sovereign citizens actively engaged in how our society should be organized into mere spectators, where the court dictates us to what we're allowed to do or not do. I'm grateful, Virg, that you circle back and really underscore we're not against corporations. We are vehemently opposed to the idea that corporations have constitutional rights. Most corporations today are just businesses trying to do commerce, and that's fine. Probably literally 95 to 99% of the incorporated entities in this country would not be affected one iota by what we're doing at Move to Amend. The only ones that would actually be affected are those huge transnational corporations that are attempting to control every aspect of our economy and our lives, and those few corporations that the billionaire class use to overturn the laws that I've just mentioned.
Let me follow up with you and ask a question about who should politically be concerned about this. Is this a liberal issue? Is this a conservative issue? An independent issue? Libertarian? Green Party? Who is concerned with this issue?
Well, I will tell you that the polling data shows that the answer is everyone. And when I say that, I'm very sincere. 80% of the American people, up to 85%, depending on what you poll, opposes the idea that corporations should have constitutional rights. Joe, what's especially interesting is that number stays about the same whether it's Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, Green. So there is almost universal agreement with the approach that we're taking at Move to Amend. And it gets even better, because this entire movement, this organization known as Move to Amend, began in 2010. We were 12 people in a living room. Today, we're 400,000 people, as Ruthi said. There are 50 local affiliates like this in Duluth growing all across the country. Even better, 16 states have already called for a resolution calling for a constitutional amendment. New York is going to be the 17th very soon, maybe by the time this airs, in fact. And in November of this year, Washington State and California are going to be voting on it, so I can assure you we're going to win there. And 650 communities have passed resolutions of support of Move to Amend. Duluth was one of the first, so thank you, Duluth. But my favorite objective number, Joe, we've put this issue on the ballot in 350 communities. That's not just city council members voting. That's residents, citizens getting a chance to weigh in. We've been on the ballot 350 times across this country. Guess how many times we've won? 350. We literally haven't lost yet. And yes, that includes very liberal places. It also includes San Francisco, Boston, Madison. It also includes places like Duluth, where it's not super left, it's not super conservative. It's sort of a down the middle, like we call it like we see it kind of community. That's my impression of Duluth. Good people, but not sort of hard left or hard right. So we win there. But we also won in Salt Lake City, Utah. We won in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is the hometown of Republican Tea Party Governor Scott Walker. Right? They haven't voted for a Democrat for president or Congress in 40 years in Waukesha. Move to Men was on the ballot there. We won a supermajority. We won in Montana, y'all. Right? I mean, one of the most politically, culturally conservative places in the country. We won 74% of the vote. All I'm saying is, to answer your question, who is this attracting? Who is concerned about this? Literally everyone. In this polarized moment in politics in this country, Move to Amend may be one of the very few issues where there is almost universal support and agreement.
Wow. Okay, I want to ask kind of a little background question on that, which has to do with how has Citizens United changed our democracy or our government? How is it that people are so concerned with this movement that is growing so quickly?
Ruthi, you want to?
No, I think I'd rather you take that one.
Okay, so look, let's remember that Citizens United as a decision did not start this problem, right? It's important to go back 100 years to the creation of the doctrine of corporations having constitutional rights, and put this into context, especially because of the history of Duluth. Remember that this was the age of the robber barons, when the industrialists and the railroad corporations were literally buying and selling legislation. I mean, even in our sanitized history textbooks, we're taught about the age of the robber barons and how corrupt it was. Well, it was at that era that literally the beginning of the privatization of our elections, where big money was starting to be used to elect congresspeople, to try to influence state legislatures, and to pass laws that were really shoved down the throats of ordinary people. But there was a fight back, and the Great Populist Uprising is what it's called. And what you had were workers in factories, and Duluth, of course, was the site of many of those great struggles for labor justice in this country. But you also had, the farmers, of course. Let's remember that in Minnesota, it's not the Democratic Party, is it?
It's the DFL.
It's the Democratic Farm Labor Party, which was a function of organized labor and farmers actually coming together to assert their rights and their vision of how the society should operate. And so there was a fight back and a struggle. And politically, we'll call it the progressive approach, was winning in many places. And so the court created the idea that corporations had constitutional rights, so that if they lost politically, they could still go into court and win in a place where the political pressure was insulated from the people. So all I'm getting at is the context is very important. The doctrine of corporations having constitutional rights is over 100 years old, and there is a shameful history, all of it available on our website, to see what I'm talking about, or what we're talking about, to demonstrate why corporate constitutional rights is not just a legal technicality. It literally is preventing us from having the world that we want to live in.
No, I mean, in fact, one of the things that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when our founding fathers created our Constitution, they left out the word corporation or corporations entirely. It's not there. And it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't like, no, they intentionally didn't want something like this. And in fact, for 100 years after the American Revolution, it didn't exist the way multinational corporations are, transcontinental corporations that you mentioned. They did not exist legally, they could not exist like
They
that.
wouldn't have existed like that, to be sure. Again, the history is very clear. Our founders understood the role of the corporation very well. I mean, after all, the Massachusetts Bay Trading Colony was a company. North and South Carolina were corporations. In fact, all of the original colonies were literally corporations. And the founders understood the concept of the corporation and said, as a tool, we want to encourage the corporation for its appropriate use. So the founders put political limits on the corporation. For example, a corporate charter could only be good for 5 to 10 years. The corporate charter application process went through the political process. The state legislature had to approve it, both the House and the Senate. The governor had to sign off on it. That's what we call a law today.
Right.
Think about that for a moment. The very notion of limited liability incorporation for our founders was the functional equivalent of a law. And it took legislative enactment and political expression to even create it. And if it were created as a privilege, not a right, but a privilege, it actually required then not only limited in time, but that you had to do public good. That if you ever did anything that was considered to be against the public interest, your corporate charter would be revoked. I mean, there's not a single one of the big Fortune 500 corporations that could even operate under the political restrictions that the founders had. So it's important to recognize Virg's point, and that is that this doctrine of corporate constitutional rights is not only illegitimate, it's not only illogical, it also flies in the face of the very concept of how this country claims it operates and it claims that it was created to do.
That's incredibly important history, I think, for everyone to know much more about than we typically know. So thank you for that, and I'm really glad that the website has so much information on it for people to access. I'd like to follow up a little bit with some of those historic points that you made to ask that if the movement to end corporate personhood succeeds, how could corporations function? Could they still function the way they do today? Would they be sued more? Would they be held more or less responsible for following rules or regulations? What would the result be of a success of this movement?
Well, first of all, the corporations would have less of a control, and I think that it would be. I mean, we can't really say exactly what it's going to look at. Like, we can't look into the future. But the idea is that the corporations would not have the control, the ability to overturn laws that citizens have enacted themselves. That's really the big problem that we're seeing. A municipality can pass a law saying that a corporation, saying they don't want fracking around them, okay, or they don't want a Walmart moving in and taking over, and the mom and pop businesses that have been there closing down. They can pass a law like that, but then a corporation can come in and say, well, wait, that doesn't fit with our rights to make money. And so then they can sue the municipality right now. So the important thing that I think would happen is that local government would be able to say, here's how we want our local world to be, and not have a big corporation come in and say, you don't get to choose how you live, we get to choose how you live.
Okay.
And I would think that the money equaling my free speech, to me that would be dramatic, because as it is, I have a voice, and we can do these kind of things, and when it gets time for elections or times for lobbying, I have a voice. But if money is the same as my voice, is the same as my speech, my voice gets dwindled down to a whisper, and that's a critical problem right now in our country.
Absolutely. I think that is a problem, because I see not that a lot of people say people are apathetic. And I don't think that's it. I think that people have lost the idea that they do have control, that they have control over their own environment, that their own lives, and that they have control about how their community exists. And they've lost the idea that they do have that control. And I want that back.
And I
want to have it. I don't think I've ever really experienced it.
I will say that I agree with Ruthi. It's not that Americans or Duluth residents or anybody else are apathetic. I think that we have been trained to be cynical. Mm-hmm. We've been trained to think that we actually don't have power. but we do. But here's the key, Joe. We have almost no power as an individual. That's part of the reason why the ruling elite want to keep us separate and individual and thinking of ourselves as individual consumers rather than empowered citizens, because the only way you can really exercise power is collectively organizing. And that's the reason I'm going to encourage you, please go to that website, movetoamend.org, and sign up so that you can be part of the growing movement both in Duluth and Minnesota. Because this movement is getting larger, stronger, and better organized every day. And you know what? The corporate media has never covered us once. The media that we get are cable access programs like this, community radio, and the internet. All places that the corporations have not yet been able to take over and squelch and filter and tell a narrative. And that's the reason why this is so important. But conversations like this do not happen on corporate media.
It sounds like you're talking a little bit about a divide and conquer approach. So maybe you can expound a little bit. And I think you're also talking a little bit about how the young people of our country and of the world are getting their media and their information, and how that's just changing a little bit, and how does that relate to the move to amend?
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. You're right. I do think that the ruling elite have historically used a divide and conquer. And I think that we need to name explicitly the biggest tool that they use is race. Whiteness in this country was created by the ruling elite. 400 years ago, nobody would have talked about being white. Now, Europeans would talk about being German or Norwegian or English. Ethnicity was definitely something that they understood, and the whole notion of the colonial powers, I don't want to sugarcoat that and make it seem like everything was wonderful, but what I will say is that this notion of even being white was just not part of the reality. How did whiteness come into being? It's actually a fascinating story. Because in this country, the wealthy, the ruling elite, the 1/2 of 1%, that were renting, all of whom happen to have pigment like ours, right? But they didn't call themselves white. They didn't think that way. But what happened was things like Bacon's Rebellion, where enslaved Africans got together with European indentured servants who also had this same pigment, and even indigenous peoples in this country, and they realized, hey, there is a class system of exploitation and oppression. This is unfair. There's more of us than there are of them. And they begin to struggle collectively, cooperatively together. And the ruling elite realized that this was very dangerous for them. So they created a whole concept around whiteness so that indentured servants were still servants. They were still lower class, but they were elevated above blacks, elevated above indigenous. So they began to stratify the thing, so that whiteness became gave you certain privileges. Even though you were still a servant to the ruling class, you got tremendous privileges, and blacks and indigenous were pushed even further down. So the whole notion of whiteness was literally created as a way to divide the working class apart from one another, and it's been devastatingly effective. One of the reasons why Move to Amend makes it very clear is that we have got to address this construct of race that has been used to divide us, and come together as human beings that recognize, and again, we cannot sugarcoat the history of patriarchy or white supremacy or the horrors of the illegitimate enslavement of Africans and what that meant, and learn from the struggles of women and African Americans and others to assert their rights, even as we recognize if we come together in this sort of unified approach to what we the people really is, all of the people, we collectively actually have the ability to transform society.
So it sounds like there's an underlying analysis and strategy around solidarity. Where do youth fit into this picture?
Ruthi?
Well, I'm an educator. I worked in the public school system. I was a public school teacher. I taught English and theater, and the youth are. I'm noticing the youth getting really excited.
Okay.
We have been working with universities, colleges, high schools, even a little bit, trying to educate the youth of our country. We have just hired a young lady who is heading up our youth and education movement and doing outreach specifically. We've been working with several colleges and universities. We were in Ohio doing just this sort of thing and speaking to classrooms. Sometimes we go into classrooms and speak to them. I know that some of the Duluth people here are going into classrooms
we've done that. Yep.
and talking to students. And this is really, really important because unfortunately this narrative is being perpetuated in our schools, in our textbooks, that covering over and whitewashing. I was a teacher in Texas, and what really frustrated me as a teacher is over the 13 years of my career, I really saw education change and get really, really different. I lost control in the classroom, and this was all because of the testing. And the testing is very, very profitable to certain corporations. They sell this test that must be administered. Then they sell textbooks that teach to the test. And they even, when I finally left, sold a curriculum to the school that the teachers must use in order to teach to the test. And unfortunately, those textbooks whitewash this history. They don't talk about slavery anymore. They call them displaced people. So they're not even talking about it. So it's really important that we do. One project that we're working on right now is Constitution Day. In September, there is Constitution Day, and any school that gets federal money must do something about the Constitution. So we have been creating lesson plans to use for colleges, universities, high schools, even for middle schools, if they'll do it, that teaches about the Constitution and how it's been amended over the years and how these laws have changed it.
That's very interesting. I don't think I was even aware that Constitution Day existed in the school system, so that's wonderful. Virg, do you want to add anything?
Just that we get invited into some classrooms, and I like that. But I'm an educator as well, and I was in the Proctor School District for 37 years in the Duluth area and at St. Scholastica, and that is my background as well. And I saw much of what you're seeing. And just because we can test and keep the records doesn't mean we should. And it's really important that we also need to focus on what is really important when you send your kids to school. What is really important? Is it what the test can detect? Is it something a multiple choice test can detect? And sometimes the answer is no, and we have to be able to be aware of that. And so I am equally concerned in that area as well.
And I think it's really worth, let's dive into the education sector or the institutions of education and recognize that the most important thing that a human child learns how to do is how to walk and how to talk. And in the corporatized version of education, the first thing they're told is sit down and shut up. I think it's really important that we think about, well, wait, why is that? Because every educator that I've ever met becomes a teacher because they want to nurture children to become critical thinkers, to take their place as adults, as productive members of society. It is, and I'm not being sycophantic, it's a noble profession. It's a calling. People take these jobs for which they are paid very little because they are called to want to actually help nurture children. You cannot convince me that standardized testing and teaching children to simply take tests is actually preparing them to be critical thinking sovereign citizens who were able to actually take a proper role in a democratic Republican form of government. And why has this happened? Because it is profitable for a few large corporations that have corporatized the entire education system. I can't tell you the number of teachers that I've talked to that have either retired, taken early retirement, actually actually just quit the profession, anguished for having done so, because they can no longer teach children and nurture them the way that they want to. And we can take the corporatization of education as a specific example of how corporations are not just exercising power, they're trying to rule us. And they're infecting the minds of our children with this individualism, consumerism, materialism, rather than inspiring them to think about more broadly about what does it mean to be a human? What is the human situation? What is our proper role in our natural ecosystem? These are the things that children should be thinking about and encouraged to explore.
And I would just add that ability to research on their own, to think critically, as you mentioned, critically important, but working in groups is very important. Being able to do that, working with other people, and that isn't tested, maybe partly because it's hard to do with a test, but it's not being done. And should it be? The only thing that you can test is something that you do on a multiple choice test, and the answer is clearly no. It isn't. There's a lot more important things too. And I don't devalue reading. The reading is ultimately very important, and math skills are, but they're easy to test, and so the testing companies will focus on those things over research, over working in groups, researching on their own, critically learning the scientific process. It's critically important.
It seems like the larger goals of this We the People Move to Amend movement is not simply the removal of Citizens United or the overturning of Citizens United. You are all talking about a much larger vision. You use the word sovereign citizens. You're all talking about empowerment, inclusion of every single person in this country. Is there more that you want to add about, if Citizens United were overturned tomorrow, is there more that you want to say about what that would look like?
So I guess I would say it this way. Honestly, Joe, if I could snap my fingers and have the 28th Amendment to the Constitution, magically appear in the written document, I wouldn't do it. Why? Because I know that really law follows culture. And really what we're talking about doing is inspiring, nurturing, creating, and being participants in a movement for democracy, where we the people rule ourselves, and where we actually have the kind of ability to have civil political discourse, debate, grapple over what it is that we want, and at the end of that process, be able to say, you know what, I may disagree with you, but I respect you as a human being, and I acknowledge that, and the political process should be where we debate, such things, but ultimately we have to come together in a cooperative spirit about and recognize that at the end of the day, even if we disagree on things, we're still human beings. We still have certain inalienable rights. So the process of what it's going to take, not only to amend the Constitution, but also to shift the culture so that we recognize that we actually do have power, but that if we allow to be divided around race or gender or class or sexual orientation, that these are the ways in which we're going to have to deal with those. Because really, Joe, it's not just the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. Ethically and morally, it's the right thing to do to address issues of race and gender, class, and sexual orientation. But it's critically important to succeed. We can't win an amendment or anything else really that would be considered a structural systemic win unless we address those things. So yes, Move to Amend actually invests considerable time, resources, and energy. We have a movement education program, a 7-session course of self-study where we at the national level, local folks do it as well, and we come together and just ask questions. And Virg, you'll be happy to know there is not a standardized multiple choice test at the end of that. Right? It's merely a process by which we ask these sorts of questions and learn some of the hidden history that Ruthi mentioned. So you bet there's a lot. It's way, way deeper. And Citizens United is just the latest example of corporate constitutional rights and money as speech. Because our friends and colleagues at the Women's International League and Feast and Freedom have a 20-foot-long timeline that starts at the creation of this country and goes all the way up through actually Hobby Lobby now. And an example of all the times that courts have overturned democratically enacted laws, thwarted the will of the majority using the court system. And on the bottom is all the times that people have gained rights. And you know what's interesting about that one, Joe? On that timeline, the courts are used by the ruling elite to overturn laws. When we the people win, it's because there were mass movements in the streets, in the pools, in the bowling alleys. Like, we have got to get away from thinking that this is just a legal problem. Yes, we have to have a legal strategy. Move to Amend has a very well thought out legal strategy. Go to our website. It is chock full of information. But we also have to have a strategy around art and culture and education. And an understanding around our own self-political education and awareness. And all of those things and more are part of the Move to Amend
So
structure.
it sounds like people are welcome no matter what their strengths or interests are, if they are cultural workers, if they are artists, if they are, I assume the faith community is part of this because it's such a huge part of our society. Are there other examples of how people can get involved, or how they can bring their interests or strengths?
Sure. We have several caucuses, 3 that are already installed, and then 2 that are kind of being fed fires. The first one is the Labor Caucus, and the Labor Caucus is run by people who come out of labor. David is on this one because he was a what was it?
I was a pipeline worker, local number 38.
Pipeline worker.
I used to work for a living. That's my joke. As a lawyer and a community organizer now, I say I used to work for a living.
So we have, and that is a place where we can reach out to labor halls, labor unions, the working people. We also have an art and culture caucus that I co-chair because I was a theater artist, or I actually still am. I also serve on the board of Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed, which is another organization. So we do a lot of partnering with lots of organizations. So we have an art and culture caucus, which are people who are interested in art and culture and how that is changing the narrative. We have several projects I'm very excited about. One is called Global Corpocracy, and we have a website called Global Corpocracy. It's CORPOCACY.com, which is a group of artists. It came out of a show, an art show in Houston, artists that were looking at this very idea of how corporations rule us. And that is now a virtual exhibit, so you can go and see the artwork, read interviews with the artists, and then also see how you can take action. Because that's what's really important, is being able to take action. The last caucus that's fully formed is the Interfaith Caucus. Very important. We have people going and speaking to faith communities. Faith communities pass resolutions. We're very popular with the Unitarian Universalists, but we also have Presbyterians, we have Episcopalians, we have Buddhists, we have people that identify as ethical humanists. So these are people that are looking at it from the heart, is what I think. Of how the corporate rule has hurt our environment, our physical and our beautiful land that we live on, has hurt us at the heart of that we're not taking care of, and the people who are not who have had difficulties. We're not taking care of our poor. We're not taking care of our people.
Yes.
It's really, really important. The social justice is really important to the interfaith communities.
So in addition, thank you for that. In addition to some of these forming and newly forming and operating for a while caucuses, it sounds like there's a huge number of partners that have come in to either support, endorse, or in some way strengthen this movement. So can you talk a little bit about some of the partners that are part of this?
Sure. It's a great question, and I thank you for it because it does demonstrate just the breadth of this movement. For example, one of the partners that we're really, really excited about is a group called the Pachamama Alliance, which comes out of an analysis and an understanding, not just an intellectual analysis, but a deeper understanding of the need to get into a balance, or back to a balance with nature and the heart, and we're working with the Pachamama Alliance. We're also working with Hip Hop Congress, which is a group of artists and culture workers around the whole idea of, hey, why did this art form known as hip hop, which began as an expression of liberation and joy, get corporatized and turned into this sort of gangster rap and so forth? Now, I want to be clear, Joe, it's interesting, and this is something that I've learned. There is still something called political hip hop or conscious hip hop. There's still a market for that. But you know what political hip hop or conscious hip hop was originally called? Hip hop. Literally. And what I've actually now learned is, because that's not my culture, that's not my musical genre. I come from Texas, so I'm very familiar with country music, and I'm very familiar with folk music and so forth. And what I've realized is, I'll be darned, they corporatized folk music. They corporatized country and western music. I mean, so all I'm getting at is that the partners that we have around Hip Hop Congress is moving in all sorts of tendrils to get us thinking about how to engage artists and culture workers. We work very closely with folks who are in opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. And again, that's on the left and the right, and in the middle, a great opportunity there. The other thing that's important to recognize about Move to Amend is we began as 12 people in the living room, so that we weren't an organization. All of those 12 people, though, had a history of working for democracy and corporate power issues, and so from our inception, other organizations actually came together under this umbrella. Some of those organizations, the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, Democracy Unlimited of Humboldt County, the Alliance for Democracy, the Independent Progressive Political Politics Network, Global Exchange, and Movement Rights. What I'm getting at is all of these groups actually came together to say, let's find a way to work together on some of the core issues.
And just if people go to the Move to Amend website, it's actually dozens of people who have endorsed exactly what you're working with, and you're working very directly with 35 other groups on specifically things more related to getting the money out of the politics as well.
That's right. And you're right that there were about a dozen groups in our initial founding. We call those our initial organizational relationships. We actually are now over 1,000 organizations who have endorsed Move to Amend. And there are, as Virg says, about 35 to 50 groups that we're really working with at some level. So there is an effort to collaborate at Move to Amend that we have really implemented. We're very serious about it. Now, Move to Amend internally and organizationally has an analysis, and we are definitely building an organization, but we work very hard not to get cut up into that silo effect. We really, each individual group work on it, each individual thing. What we recognize is that corporate power, the corrosive influence of money in elections as auctions, is preventing any of us from succeeding. So we try to actually look for opportunities. And in fact, we just spent yesterday with the Duluth folks, the creation of a solidarity organizing plan, which I'd invite you, Virg, to just share a little bit about what the upcoming plans there are.
And I think maybe the easiest way is for everybody to realize that we just had our meeting last night for June, but starting in July, and from every third Monday of every month, we'll be meeting at the UUCD Church. It's 835 West Superior Street, the Unitarian Universalist
Church. It's West College.
West College Street, and I'll correct that again, 835 West College Street. And so the third Monday of every month, we're meeting at 7 o'clock in the evening there, and they could learn more about it there. We will be working with many of the different groups. Right now, I'm trying to remember each one of those, but I think there were over 12 to 15 of those. And,
that's right.
And we want to reach out to all of those other groups as well, and we do have a common core with all of those. So that's what's really important.
I was impressed on the website to see who makes up the leadership team nationally of the organization. I think it's reflective of what you were just talking about in terms of who is important to have as partners in this movement. Do you want to say a little bit about the makeup of the leadership team?
Sure. The leadership team, there are 11 of us on the leadership team. We split, I think there are 6 males No, there's 5 males and 6 females. So we're more heavily female than we are male. Our demographic is everything. Well, this one is the only white male,
Okay.
which is unusual. We have people who are out, gay, queer, lesbian. We go from young to old. Our youngest is in his 20s.
Okay.
Our oldest is Jerome is about to turn 70, or is he over?
I think he's over 70.
He's over 70. So we all the way of gamut of adulthood there. Have I missed anything?
Well, I think geography.
That's right.
That's
Very
right.
proud to
Geography.
say that we include Edgar, who is in the Pacific Northwest, Bellingham, Washington, who is a farm worker organizer. We have folks in North Carolina and Georgia, upstate New York, Texas, North Carolina, Utah, Sacramento, California. We live in Eureka, California. Daniel Lee is in LA. And so the point is, our leadership at the national level is multiracial, it's multi-ethnic. Egberto, for example, is a first-generation Panamanian immigrant. It also, though, is geographically spread across the country. We all come out of organizing. We all come out of a deep commitment to grassroots empowerment. So all of our work, I mean, look, Move to Men is one of the few groups that I know that invest at the national level. We really see ourselves as support for the local group, and we make ourselves very available. The other thing that I really want to point out is we just finished a 10-year strategic plan for how to actually win the 28th Amendment. It's available on our website, movetomen.org/plan. It literally just came off the press, so we don't have one to show to you. But if you go to the website and literally movetomen.org/plan, and you can literally see this. And it went through a deliberative process. Virg, you may remember being on many of those phone calls where we solicited input.
Yep, and I'm really impressed. And initially I was disappointed it wasn't a 3-year plan. But it is realistic, and it does have a realistic vision of what's going to happen. That's one of the attractions at this point that I have in Move to Men. Besides the diversity that I see, but it is a very realistic thing when people suggest that this thing is not possible. You know, this idea of an amendment isn't possible. Something that you mentioned yesterday that you had remembered that I do believe this. You don't win races you don't enter, and you do need to get out there and do that if you want that to happen. And if you think this is important, and I do, and partly for the climate, partly for the wealth inequity. In my case, it's maybe my number 1 and 2 issue. This is how that happens.
Right.
We don't do things with the climate. We won't do things with the inequity in our country if this doesn't happen. This has to happen.
And Virg, I've heard you talk more than once about your children and your grandchildren. You're looking forward to the future generations and what their lives are going to be like. And I think that's an incredibly important commitment that you hold in this work.
That is why I
yeah.
do it.
Yes, thank you. Are there any questions or comments that we may have missed, or anything that people want to add at this point?
One thing that we didn't get to in some of the, I don't know if it's the nuts and bolts, but I'll try to keep it short. It wasn't that many years ago that multinational or transnational corporations, as far as paying for our federal budget, paid over 33%, 34% of our federal budget. Today, that number is down to 10%. And so it was 34, now it's down to 10%. If you take up the amount of money that they would have been paying over the last 12 years, it's not a coincidence that it's really close to our national debt.
Okay.
It mirrors that.
Okay.
There is a trend going on in our country, and it puts the tax burden on the middle class. It puts the tax burden on everybody else except the people who are controlling our politics.
And the other trend to notice is not only the tax burden, but look at the accumulation of wealth in this country. If you look at it, it literally ends up looking like a hockey stick. The wealthy are getting super crazy, ridiculously wealthy. Middle class is shrinking, the poor are growing. Listen, this is not an accident. This is a function of bad policies that are enriching a small number of people. You know, I do this work because I am a proud American who believes in the concepts of liberty, justice, equality, and fairness. All the things that I was taught as a little boy my country stood for,
Yeah.
I was so proud to be an American. And now I've grown up and I realized I had been lied to, that actually the way the system works is actually not, it doesn't facilitate these things. But the thing that I have learned is actually the country has gotten better many times when ordinary people organize themselves and build an American Revolution or a women's suffrage movement or an abolitionist movement or a trade union movement or a civil rights movement or an LGBT movement. You know what, folks? We need a democracy movement. We need a movement in this country where we say we are going to come together collectively and say we have the authority, we have the responsibility, we have the right to decide how our society is organized. And you know what's interesting, Joe? When you look at polling data, most people, whether they consider themselves conservatives, liberals, moderates, radicals, whatever, most people share a common vision around wanting to live in a peaceful world, a socially and racially just and fair world, a world of ecological sustainability so that our children and grandchildren can have a rich and vibrant future. There is actually a lot of common ground. We can't implement our common vision because of the notion of corporations having constitutional rights and money is speech. So my sort of concluding remarks are going to be, if you are inspired or agitated by the last 40 minutes or so, it's because you're conscious and awake and paying attention. That's good, but that's not enough. You got to get active. You got to organize and educate and agitate with other people. My appeal to you is get in touch with Virg, get in touch with Joe, get in touch with other people here in Duluth, and get involved in this growing movement, because this movement is growing, but we need you.
I think that's our last word. I thank you very much, panel. And does anyone want to give the website one last time?
www.movetoamend.org.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A great conversation.